proximity is a bit of a muddy water because actually, if someone lives at the other end of the street from someone, but they're working from home on their laptop, they may as well be 10,000 miles away from each
Yeah.
other. The problem with that is, how do you create those moments where people do gel together?
Welcome back. This is season 2 of GOBO. That's Glimpses of the Blindingly Obvious. If you're new to GOBO, it's an antidote podcast where we take a second look at things that are staring us in the face. I invite a colleague to have a good chin wag with me about a subject that's been provoking my thoughts for a while. You know, I've been thinking a lot about how tricky it's become to manage hybrid and dispersed teams. It's been on my mind, partly fueled by the back to the office debate. How do you keep everyone on the same page when they're scattered across time zones, kitchens, and offices? To answer this, I had a brilliant chat with my good friend and colleague, Anthony Ryland. As a consultant, Anthony has explored this subject quite a bit, and I reckon we've got some ideas worth sharing. So let's dive in. Hi, Anthony.
Thanks for having me on your podcast.
I'm really glad to have you on because I think what we're going to talk about today is really relevant to the reality of business nowadays. Well, maybe we ought to have some definitions, actually. I want to talk to you about dispersed and hybrid teams. Maybe a good starting point would be to clarify what we mean.
To me, what a dispersed or a hybrid team is an in-person physical team that see each other every single day, and it isn't a fully remote team. A hybrid and dispersed team, especially a dispersed team, is where you have clumps of people within your greater team working together, but those clumps can change on day by day. Because you might have some people working remotely one day who then come into an office the next day, and those group in the office change on a daily basis. And because of that, it's like a third angle to look at from a leadership point of view, because you can't rely on what you used to do for a fully in-person team. I think a fully remote team have a different set of motivators and wants. So therefore, I think a dispersed team is a good way to think about it.
I think the thing for me is whatever the label is, from a leadership perspective, the issue is I've got this situation where I do not have the members of my team with me every single day in the office, and that we can sort of chat to each other in the corridor, or they can pop their head into my office if I've got one, or come to my desk if I'm in an open plan office. So there isn't physical proximity. Whenever I trained leaders around that, one of the things that was really, really focused on was, typically I would say, was the quality and probably the frequency of leadership communication. The reaction was, oh, we're just going to turn up the dial. So whatever level of communication I'm operating at right now, if I just turn up the dial a lot more, that's just going to help me with the fact that some of my team is dispersed.
It's not just more of everything, because I'm sure most of your listeners, if they thought they were going to get more email today, they're probably just like crying in the corner of the room. So I think it's about what's important. And if you've got a dispersed team, you've got to think about loss. What are people losing that you've got to then think about as a leader to at least at a minimum replace? And I think a lot of that is those water cooler moments, the observing your boss's boss walking through the open plan office, seeing the look on their face. Are they grumpy today? Are they happy today? And being able to gauge the mood in the room. So when you're working remotely, I think, how do you gauge the mood in the organization? The issue you have, or the fear that you might have with some of your more remote workers in your dispersed teams, is that they develop an echo chamber because they talk to less people, they observe less stuff going on in the organization, and therefore they form their opinions based on less data. So as a dispersed team leader, I think you've got to be thinking about, how can I promote broader communication amongst team members? For me, being that conduit to take what's really going on in the organization, what's important, you've got a responsibility to ensure that each individual member of your team and your team as a whole connects into the greater whole understands its absolute place and purpose in that, and then feels motivated to go towards the future state that you want, which, as you say, you could say 20, 30 years ago was still an important leadership thing. I just think it's become more critical now than probably what it was, because you could rely on the team almost like being self-sufficient in the past from some aspects of communication, whereas now you have to think a little bit more.
So look, I love this idea of thinking about loss and how that impacts on relationships, I think, in the team and how the team gels together. The other thing of interest for me is this notion of mood or the emotional culture of a team. There's been some really terrific work done at Wharton University, particularly by Sigal Basadeh, where she wrote her original paper titled something like Emotional Contagion in Teams. Anyway, this whole area of how people feel at work and the fact that we are dispersed or some version of dispersed, it's a big issue for leaders. I remember years ago, organizations at the HR level, the sort of the organizational meta level, they talked about, well, what is the psychological contract we want to have with employees? I just feel that we kind of have to unpack what leadership looks like in these circumstances. There are some really terrific explainers of human behavior that we ought to revisit to try and understand what people need. I think the two that come to mind straight away are David McClelland and his model of motivational needs, and the other one is John Adair and his three-circle model of where leaders place their effort around task, team, and individual. And I think in a dispersed environment, leaders need to be closer to this idea of individual quirks, individual intrinsic needs. How do I create emotional cohesion in this team? Feeling that I'm part of this tribe when I'm hardly ever talk to anybody and never see them, kind of thing. I think it's a big issue for leaders and how they look after the team culture or the team climate, the psychological requirements of being part of this team is an emotional requirements of being part of this team, as if leaders didn't have enough to get on with. What else do you want me to do?
Yeah, well, I think that last point is very important. We need to make sure this is stuff that people can do on the job and they don't need to take time out to do something additional, because most line managers are already overloaded. We talk about HR self-service and things like that. So line managers are expected to do so much more than they did before. And then suddenly we're saying, oh yeah, and we want you to be a master degree level psychologist at the same time with everyone. I do get the fact that people turn around and say, well, what else do you want? Because we lowered the hierarchy over the last 50 years in our Western organizations. A line manager who used to just line manage now has their own job description themselves and has to produce output as well. So we're attacking line managers on every single side here. But I think there's an extra layer that is involved as well, which is the fact that the expectations of the workforce are changing, whether we had a pandemic or not, and we were working from home, working in work. People's expectations are they are treated as an individual and not employer number 14672. And there I step one back from psychological safety and psychological contracts to talk about psychological health and say, actually, there's a bigger picture here. Just like health and safety from a physical point of view, there's health and safety from a mental point of view.
Yeah.
And I think there's greater risk when you have a dispersed team that actually people fall through the net. And I think that's probably something that dispersed leaders need to think about, is actually what's the risk of people falling through the net. I think in the world of workplace psychology, there's a great term called loss and lack. And when always you need to be thinking about what's people losing and what are they lacking. And I think a great way, if you want to empathize with your people, is to try and sit in their virtual seat for a day and think, what are they experiencing? What are they engaging with? And what are they missing that you think they need? And maybe even ask them. I mean, that's a radical thought, isn't it? Get some feedback. I mean, going back to your point about leadership theories, there's probably, in the work I've done around dispersed team leadership, there's probably a few theories that pop up I think in the world of intrinsic motivation, you can't go much wrong than the very successful book by Daniel Pink. Now, I know he nicked half his stuff from self-determination theory, but actually his book on drive essentially summarizes down that actually to build intrinsic motivation, you need to give people autonomy. You need to make sure they're masters of their job and they know exactly how to do what they need to do. And you need to link in their purpose with the greater purpose. And I think those things stood before dispersed team leadership inside of our dispersed teams. You can delegate better to create autonomy, and you need to be better at delegating, as in don't micromanage after you've delegated something. Mastery, making sure people learn constantly, make sure you're connecting people and pairing people up and buddying them so they can share experiences that are beyond just delivering the task. And of course, the purpose. So I think that's one of theories, but that's one I think really helps out frame how you can be a dispersed team leader.
I think you raised a couple of points here, which I think are really important. Recognition of the multi-generational workforce we've got. I think people listening to this podcast will get bored to death of me saying this same thing. You look around and there's at least 4, if not 5 generations, all in the workplace, whatever that might look like for them. At the same time, millennials think about things totally differently and have different expectations and working to, say, baby boomers. So at one level, that's true in terms of how they relate to work and their line manager and everything else. But actually, if you unpeel the onion further and further and further around these generations, at a very, very fundamental level, we probably have a lot more in common. The notion of feeling valued, the feeling of that I'm making a contribution that makes a difference, and that I'm actually enjoying the work I'm doing. I feel there's some purpose in what I'm doing. So there's, at a very surface level differences, but at a human level, I think there are a lot of similarities. I think I would overlay that with McClelland and his model of motivational needs, in terms of what sparks individuals. His model is power, affiliation, and achievement. So achievement is all around getting stuff done and being recognized for getting stuff done. Affiliation is like, I like being with the people. I belong to this tribe, and I like having people around me. And power is not so much being in charge, but more about I'm in control of my day, or I'm in the know and I can influence. So that kind of relates a little bit to autonomy in Pink's terms, or self-determination theory. There's a big issue there about rethinking self-awareness and re-examining how I lead and relate to these people in this situation. And then the other side of it is proximity is about physical closeness, but I think the mood or the emotion of the climate of the team is more about that connectedness and that emotional proximity. And what does a leader do to facilitate or not that situation? So I don't know. I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but I think it's what I'm getting at is these are all massive considerations for leaders and leadership effectiveness going forward, because I think it's the general direction of where the world is going to, that we're all connected through technology, but not always connected psychologically or emotionally in a team work context.
Yeah, I mean, there was so much there, Joe.
I know. I do ramble.
But it's interesting because it is kind of connected. And going all the way back to talking about this 5 generations in the workplace, well, that's another great example of how we like to categorize people around us, when actually in reality, in every one of these generations, not everyone is homogeneous. You don't get to January the 1st, 1985, and suddenly everyone in the maternity ward has a totally different expectation from the world around them. When I started my career, it was expected that for the 5 store managers of the store, we were called by our surnames. And that was me coming from university. That was really weird. I was called Mr. Ryland, and I was
Oh
21
no.
years old, and someone who was like a generation older than me was calling me that. But it just shows that generations were moving there. I just think what's happening is the expectations are changing faster because technology in the world is changing faster. We're mixing together in a globalized world. So therefore, I think we're trying to categorize people in shorter and shorter timescales. But no matter how we categorize them, what we're essentially trying to do is trying to identify the needs of the people
Yeah.
that in each of those categories. And as we know, half of motivational theories are all about identifying needs. If you look at like Maslow's and Hertzberg and everything like that, it's all about needs. And so motivation is the behavior that you outwardly produce towards satisfying those needs. So it does go back to the fact that the dispersed team leader needs to take a very individualized approach to understanding each worker within the team and identifying what is going to press their buttons and how do I connect that in with the narrative that I'm trying to produce and how to gel the team together. So I think no matter how we categorize the workforce, I think it's still an important thing. Now, you then go on to talk about proximity, and I think proximity is a bit of a muddy water now because actually, if you've got a team who were all together before the pandemic, who are now all or in a dispersed team, now proximity, if someone lives at the other end of the street from someone, but they're working from home on their laptop, they may as well be 10,000 miles away from each
Yeah.
other because actually that the proximity, they're working inside their own homes. Where it does become an issue is actually we've started to recruit people around the country because we now have a mainly dispersed team. The problem with that is, how do you create those moments where people do gel together? Because I've started to encounter this in some of the team workshops that I've been doing. Because we came at the first workshop, everyone came in to be together. We do a little bit about personalities and stuff like that. But now we're starting to recruit people who are 200 miles away because we're saying, well, actually, it shouldn't matter because we're a dispersed team. The issue becomes when you then want to bring those pull people in together and have that kind of half day together because someone has to get on an aeroplane or a train, take 2 days out to come down to do it, and therefore the expectation of what they're going to get out of that half day team workshop now goes through the roof. And there's a lot more pushback saying, well, actually, I've got childcare responsibilities that I've baked into the way I work. So I think proximity is an issue. And then how does that then fit into motivations?
Oh, I totally agree. So in Spain, we have a saying called el momento de la verdad. That's the moment of truth. That's basically when the bullfighter's standing in front by himself with a cape and he's got a 500-kilo bull in front of him. It's a moment of truth. But I think in leadership terms of teams, there are lots of mini moments of truth. There are going to be loads of moments from onboarding all the way through to this person is no longer a member of my team. They've actually moved on to somebody else or, career move or whatever it might be. There are going to be loads and loads of moments of connection between the team leader and individuals and the team in this dispersed environment. It's not additional, it's through the work. And I just feel that the skill development or the development generally, and won't be just behavioral skills, be emotional skills and greater awareness and greater willingness to be vulnerable and role model. That's what we want to create in this team. All of those are moments through the work. And I think the training need or the development need is that stuff. I think there's the emotional proximity, even when there's 100 miles or even 100 yards between us physically, of leaders really demonstrating genuine interest and care for the individuals in their team and being able to manage those moments, maybe micro moments, whether it's in an one-to-one situation or a group setting, where the team leader is constantly building connections with people. And so the end output of all of this is somehow the members of that team feel really good about being a member of this team, look forward to those moments where we are on a team meeting and we're discussing whatever we might be discussing. So I think that's the part of the development requirement for leaders, is to understand how does that work, more individualistic approaches to needs, motivational needs, psychological needs of members of the team, etc. And I think that's where we need to go from a development point of view.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I'm reminded of a conversation I had about 15 months ago on one of my own podcasts. Not plugging it, don't worry, Joe, but it was with a guy called Wayne Clark,
I know Wayne, yeah.
Wayne, really into leadership.
World-class leader, isn't he?
Yes, now you're plugging his business.
Tapped.
He said on his last podcast with me that actually I said, what's the difference between leaders in the new world of dispersed team leadership compared to the old? He said, there's no difference. He said, what you found is that the best leaders had no issues as they went into lockdowns and things like that. He said, because they had already built up a massive pot of goodwill by having those moments of truth, by understanding the person inside out. So they had the connection. So when you all went totally remote to begin with in the pandemic, they could keep those relationships going. It was the people who relied on each team member supporting each other, the leaders who were quite laissez-faire to those relationships, that actually, when everyone went remote, they had nothing to start with. They floundered, they didn't know what to do. So he said, actually, great leaders were okay through the pandemic. It was the mediocre leaders who had got away with being mediocre leaders because everyone was just in the office near them. But they saw those huge shortfalls. And I think that's important to what you were saying, because it shows the absence of that really affected dispersed team leadership. So when we're saying it's not about you doing extra work, it just says, well, you should have been doing it in the first place. It's just you could get away with a slightly easier style of leadership before, but now you've got to be a little bit more aware, be that self-awareness and emotional intelligence, or just generally have two little antennae up in your head whenever you're talking to any of your team at any time, to pick up on that mood in the room. And I think that's why when we say to leaders, look, okay, it's not extra work, but actually you might think it is to begin with because you were getting away with not quite working at your maximum in these certain areas beforehand.
Yeah, I sort of 80% agree with all of that. I think when we take the perspective of what's missing, the lack of, a lot of teams coalesce around the notion of we're all in crap together. So that's our commonality. Therefore, we can't rely on our team leader because they're too busy doing whatever they're doing. We're kind of suggesting that effective dispersed team leadership is needed. I would have to ask why. Why is it important? And I just feel at a human level, I just want to like working with this group of people and enjoy the notion of what we're trying to achieve together and celebrate our successes and failures together. So there's the togetherness, the connectedness, the belongingness element, which I think has come more to the fore in dispersed team situations, because I think the lack of belonging is very easy to grow in dispersed teams.
Yeah, I'll go back to the simplistic question you asked at the start of that, which was, why is it important? I think there's a few things there. I think thing number one, dispersed teams, and by dispersed teams, I just mean individuals who work in a dispersed way, have had their home and work blurred.
Yeah.
The borders between them. So there's a great theory, border theory by Sue Clark, 2000. There's a research paper out there. You can download it for free, actually, on Google Scholar. And she identified that there's this barrier, this border that we transition through from work to non-work. And I say non-work rather than home because actually, for a lot of people, their work is part of their life. They quite like it. So, and I think the fact that we've blurred that means that people's sense of needing to belong quite often was just outside of the workplace. So they had their football team, they had their family, they had whatever they needed. We all still need to belong to something. If you ask anyone, oh, just take a couple of minutes to describe yourself, quite often they don't talk about their facial features. They quite often say, oh, yeah, I really like playing the guitar, or I belong to this group. So they associate themselves with a belonging, with a certain associational group of people. So I think people need that sense of belonging. And actually, in the turbulent world that we're in at the moment, you're giving them that sense of belonging in an organization is therefore going to open the doors to other things.
Yeah.
And those other things include things like intrinsic motivation. So you can then start connecting people's motivation in. But if you don't start thinking about why we should be engaging with people, then you're not going to ever get to that intrinsic motivation. Engagement, if you have someone who's engaged, they will more likely give you discretionary effort, and then go above and beyond the standard job description. Discretionary effort is essentially what most organizations in the Western world rely on to give you the differentiator compared to your competitors. So another way of looking at engagement is the anti-burnout way of looking at it. In a world that's very isolated, there's a greater fear that you're going to get burned out.
Yeah.
So actually, if you work on that, you engage people more, they're less likely to get burned out. So another case for the why is actually we need to engage people in a very dispersed place because actually we're going to reduce their risk of mental health issues. What I think we need to work on as dispersed leaders is actually the positive mental attitude of the individual. And the positive mental attitude comes by understanding some of the concepts in positive psychology, which was launched by the American Psychological Association in 2000. In the UK, Iona Bonnewell is a great person to find a book about and read about positive psychology. And most of those concepts around reframing and bounded optimism to have are actually the other end of the scale. So actually, if you
That's
kind of
what I
have a
mean.
look at some of the things to develop in your people around positive psychology to give them that positive mental attitude, you're kind of doing the resilience work through the back door without calling it negativity resilience kind of thing. All of those things, stacking them up in under the why should we do this, means that if we don't do it, we're going to have very unhealthy employees from a mental point of view who aren't engaged, who are at risk of burnout, who, because there's not a sense of belonging, will start turning their eyes elsewhere because it's a lot easier to find another job when you're not in the office 9 till 5, Monday to Friday, because it's easier to jump on a Zoom call for an interview when no one's looking. So I think there's a huge argument for the why case, but it's not sometimes a good profit and loss argument.
That's a really excellent way of looking at it, the profit and loss side of things, whether you're in the office all together or whether you're dispersed. Feeling positive emotions at work with the people I work with has positive results. We've, I think, in the past missed the emotional culture piece, how people feel, whether they're actually there literally sitting next to you or whether they're miles away, what it feels like to be part of this team and how that influences the notion of belonging. So I think leaders could do a lot more around this subject, but they need a bit of help. Don't expect leaders to have the answers to all of this overnight. But it's worth thinking about because it's just the brutal reality of the way that things are going, that we're not going to be sitting next to each other, and technology is facilitating that a lot more.
Yeah, and I think we've learned a lot already since the pandemic. I think to begin with, the tail was wagging the dog, as in the technology, you had to have a chat thing going up the side, going ping, ping, ping every time you were on a Teams call and everything. I think some people are learning actually, I need to go back to concentrating on one thing at a time, and the technology is great. It's not the answer to everything. So I think we've learned a lot.
The conclusion I'm drawing here is there are so many facets to the notion of leading in the world we live in right now. One context is we are probably leading more and more dispersed teams than we were 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So it raises lots of questions for organizations when they're thinking about leadership development.
Yeah, a few things pop up. I think leaders today who have been leaders for a little while to have a bit of humility and think, actually, the world has changed. How much have I changed my leadership style in the pace that the world has changed? And really have a good reflection on, okay, so maybe I need to develop myself and be open to development. Look around you. Look at the other leaders that you work with, the other managers you work with. Which ones are doing this dispersed leadership thing better than others? Identify them, and then try and work out and observe their behaviors. And what is it that's engaging the other people, motivating people, making you think that they're a good leader? And try and write those down and identify these behaviors, and then try them out. Experiment on them, try them out yourself, and see if that works for you. I do think that actually good observation skills about thinking about who are those great leaders that surround me and trying to identify what is it that makes them great in this dispersed world is a great place to start for any leader.
Yeah, I agree. I feel incredibly energized in one sense in terms of having explored the subject with you. But on the other side, I'm absolutely knackered because there's so much to unpick. And we could talk about this subject for quite some time. Thank you ever so much for joining me in this conversation. Thanks so much, Anthony. I look forward to speaking to you and seeing you soon. And that's a wrap on today's GOBO chat. If you've got anything useful out of today's ramblings, well, that's a bonus. Do me a favor, hit subscribe so you can catch the next episode, and I promise to try and make sense. Got thoughts on today's topic? Drop a comment. I'd love to pretend I know the answer. And if you've got a mate struggling with dispersed teams, why not share the podcast with them? Let's all muddle through together. Until next time, bye for now.